Me.
I feel like that's my answer every time. Yes, maybe.
Okay, we're live.
Perfect. I'm just giving it a moment to make sure that the stream comes up on my other screen and doesn't go in my headset. Do I have to refresh? Oh yeah, we are live. Cool. All right, so hello everyone and welcome to another Nomad Community Office Hours. Today we're going to be talking about design and the what's and whys of and philosophy of how we do our design, as well as some of the features. And I'm really excited to be talking to both of them about this, well, both of our guests, because I don't know that much about this subject. And I think every time you talk about it, there's just so much I learned from it. And it's just really cool. I think I say that every time too, I'm sorry. It's still true. But just before we get into that, just as a reminder, I'm your host, Jacquie Grindrod, and I'm a developer advocate here at HashiCorp. And if you have any questions or comments, we'd love for you to interact with us in the chat. But as you do, please just remember to mind our code of conduct in the virtual space. In general, that means to be welcoming, inclusive, friendly, and patient. Be considerate, be respectful, and please be professional. You can review our code of conduct at hashicorp.com/community-guidelines. And with that, let's get started. I guess, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Michael Lange. I'm a UI engineer at HashiCorp. Been here for, it'll be 4 years at the end of May. Somehow that time has already passed. And I've been working on the Nomad UI since I started. So there was about 3 months or so when we were in stealth mode working on it before shipping it in 07, which is at HashiConf 2017. I'm getting my years right.
Perfect. How about yourself, Buck?
Hey, I'm Buck. I am approaching my 2-year mark at the company. I was hired to work on the Nomad UI, and I live in Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Canadians, yes. Also anniversaries. I forgot to mention my 1-year anniversary isn't exactly a week from today, so that's pretty cool. So today we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, our design and philosophy. And I just wanted to be clear to our viewers that we're also welcoming questions that are about the Nomad features, or if you have questions more about general design or things like that, please feel free to ask those as well. And Michael, would you like to talk a little bit about why we have a UI philosophy?
I would. So this is something that I don't think we've talked about much publicly. Maybe like HashiConf, but I don't think we've blogged about it or what have you. But just sort of like the idea about why we have like a dedicated UI rather than leaving it to the community, why it's so important. We have 2 people who are, UI specialists working on it. So this is, of course, something I've thought about a lot, considering that there were 0 lines of UI code when I started. And I think for us, there's sort of 3 grounding principles that answer why we have a UI and also go into our decision-making process for how we determine roadmap. The first is complementary, not an alternative. So this is just sort of the idea that people who use DevOps tools, they are going to sort of fluidly go between the CLI and the UI. It isn't sort of like this old-fashioned notion where you use a UI, but then once you're good enough, you level up and use the CLI. That's just sort of untrue. Just to sort of like underline how untrue it is, it's like we don't have that same conversation about people leveling up from the CLI to like an API. It's like these are different tools that do different things. We need to recognize that. And that comes through when we sort of design things because we want to play to the strengths and weaknesses of each space. So practically speaking, when we're designing UI features, that means that we're going to look for opportunities to sort of elevate the UI beyond the expectations you might have for a CLI for the same feature. We don't want to just sort of like copy paste that CLI table output into an HTML table and call it a day. So this means you're going to see more charts and diagrams when possible, and just as much hyperlinking as possible to sort of click around. And it's just sort of like solid design principles as well to achieve visual hierarchy and makes things easier to scan. A personal anecdote, Schmeichel, team lead, was working on the C2M sort of over the last few months, which like us Nomad engineers, we use Nomad, of course, but we aren't like really in it as practitioners. So this was a moment for him to really dig into it. And I just loved all the messages he had gushing about the quality of the UI. And he was like, holy crap, like using this is actually awesome. And I think that just sort of like goes to show you that there's a place for the UI, even for people that are clearly very technical developers and operators. And a couple examples of these sort of products that play to these strengths. We put a lot of attention into this for things like the topology visualization, for task lifecycle, and also global search. And also the opposite is true, where there are certain features where we could go much further into sort of the design and execution of it, but we hold back because we realize it's a weakness of the UI. So for instance, the job submit workflow, it's just a text area that you can paste the job spec into. That's nice for like one-off batch job, but we really don't want to sort of go against our own philosophy of automation and infrastructure as code. And this is also true for, say, like registering volumes. There are a lot of API endpoints that are sort of in this more like write/create category that the UI tries to either avoid or be careful around, because we don't want to encourage people to not make things as code when that's the preferred way to do it. Then the second principle here is to enable collaboration. Part of collaboration is making participation in Nomad as accessible as possible to a broader audience of users. So of course, Nomad is always going to have this kind of like, or any cluster is going to have a core team of really in the weeds, deeply technical engineers. But they're also going to have sort of an outer ring of developers and another outer ring of maybe developers who aren't used to creating like high performance applications. They're more in sort of like an analytics or a data science type of role. And then there's another outer ring of people who have business functions that need to understand what's kind of going on in a cluster or just sort of the operations of a company, and expecting them to sort of figure out the CLI and how to hook that up to a remote cluster is just asking for a lot, when we could instead just sort of have a URL. You click it and then you're there. And there's also kind of comes through in other places. So I think we did this really well with node drain, where as you're walking through the workflow in the UI, there's all sorts of sort of inline help to sort of explain different options, explain what's happening, and make sure it's very clear what's going on. And it's like, we're not in denial about what's going on, like sort of the life cycle of Nomad. We don't expect people to use the UI node drain as their primary way to drain nodes. But you know, people have to learn it at some point. So it's nice to be able to have that sort of to walk through your first couple node drains, and then eventually you're going to automate that. And I think we also sort of push it to the limit with tools like exec, where it would be really easy to just not support exec in the browser and say, oh, well, at that point, you really do have to figure out what you're doing on the CLI. But instead, Buck actually went through and made a complete exec workflow that feels like a native terminal, but it all works through the browser, which is just excellent. And also, just sort of the other half of this collaboration is creating opportunities or quote unquote happenings to allow people to sort of share their work and work together. And I think that like our job was already kind of done before we started, just because the web is already such like a social place. Hyperlinks are just ridiculously useful. Be able to send a link to a coworker, to be able to share exactly what you're looking at, or also to integrate this with sort of these workflows that are outside of Nomad for like chat ops or page alerts or any sort of emails that you might be sending. It's just incredibly useful to be able to have those as sort of like a common language when working with your coworkers. And the third and final principle is insights and debugging. This is the one that we finally started to dig into. It's something that I probably first wrote down 2 years ago, but there are two of us and many more backend engineers, so it takes us a bit to sort of catch up. But as I mentioned in the teaser video a few months ago, I really feel like the UI is kind of coming into its own. We're getting to the point where we can go beyond sort of the expectations of parity. And this sort of calls back to UIs being complementary as well, where we can create things that are specific to the UI because we expect users to use both the CLI and the UI fluidly. And this is true outside of Nomad also. So developers have always been using UIs for debugging. Like if you think about browser dev tools or pprof or any sort of visual kit tool you may use, if you have to work through a hairy merge, it's like there's always sort of this tool that isn't your CLI that may not be your primary interface, but it's something that you can fall back onto when things get call for it. And it's also true for insights as well. Insights, it's kind of like this meaningless, weird buzz, it's like business word at this point, but to sort of dig into it a little bit more, if you think about tools like Grafana or Datadog, New Relic, all those types of things, there's sort of this workflow where it starts off with these course charts, sort of like a synthesis of information. And from there, you can sort of scan for anomalies. And then once you find the anomaly, you can dig in and work through looking at timestamps and kind of go through stack traces, et cetera. So there's a workflow where you start sort of broad and can narrow in on something. And visual explanations are just excellent for that. This was top of mind when we developed the two features we're going to talk about today, which is the topology visualization and dynamic application sizing recommendation cards. I think that's my spiel, Jackie.
Perfect. Buck, if you don't mind, I wanted to pass the question to you. That's actually not from chat, it's my question. But Michael had just mentioned, I think earlier, about you working on the exec feature in browser. And I mean, I've used terminals and I've exec'd into pods and stuff, but what kind of work goes into actually making that work in the browser that maybe a person like me in ops wouldn't think about? Or like cool things you worked on with it, really, it can be more open-ended than what I just asked.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I was able to benefit from a lot of existing work. Most of the implementation relies on something called Xterm.js, which is a terminal rendering thing that's widely used. I think even VS Code uses it. So Nomad's exec implementation uses WebSockets to like represent the in and out streams of the process. So I just sort of hooked up the WebSockets to Xterm.js, which took care of almost everything, really, like because it's a full featured terminal implementation. So that was nice because every time I look at like ANSI codes and whatever, like, you know, terminals, when you have a little spinning cursor or whatever, like it's really just rewriting, it's like overwriting stuff. Like there's all this secret stuff that you don't know, like control codes and stuff. So I have a superficial understanding of that stuff, and I was able to get it working just by the WebSocket thing. So yeah, it's like you have a terminal in the browser. It's maybe not as perfect as your like customized home terminal, but it's pretty good for something in the browser, I think.
I think Buck is selling himself a little short as well. The part that sticks out to me the most when they were working on that feature was like the attention to detail that went into making sure a bunch of common shortcuts still existed. And that did not come out of Xterm. That's extra sugar we had to put on top.
Yeah, part of that was about the design. There was sort of a question of like, how do we actually configure the shell or the command that's run when you start the exec session? And the design, we went through some ideas, like maybe it could be a little pop-up in the sidebar, like bash or CSH, as you would say. But ultimately, we decided that it would be like a command, like you were typing an SSH command or something. But then there's just this like tiny part at the end that is the configurable shell or whatever command you want to start. And as somebody that painstakingly discovered things like Control U to delete to the beginning of the line and stuff, like I wanted that muscle memory stuff to still work. So there was some sort of, I did have to learn about those control code things or like remind myself about those things. And also I made like feature requests to Xterm to say like, could you support this? I can't even remember what it's called. It's like something about line wrapping and like backward something. It was like ridiculous thing that terminals are supposed to support and Xterm didn't have. And they were like, yes, which is nice because I didn't want to do it myself. But it's cool to be able to benefit from existing stuff and also push the limits of it.
I was like, where's my unmute? There it is. I just like actually was typing that to myself because I didn't know about control use. So today I learned already. Is there, I guess I should have asked first if there was anything you wanted to touch on with the philosophy or like the whys and whats of how we do UI that Michael touched on before I went into a more specific question. But, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I am like a very hybrid kind of approach person. Like I did use VI for years, and um, I now I use VS Code, but I use Git command line things, but then I also use source tree, which is a Git UI. So like I'm pretty used to blending these things together, and I think that it's nice to have multiple opportunities or like avenues for getting your work done, and not have this sort of. I mean, people can be sort of snobby sometimes about UI, like graphical interfaces, because they think that like CLIs are the power user thing, or like the way that like real developers do things or whatever. And I just am not into that sort of I don't know, snobbishness or whatever. So I'm glad to like sometimes CLIs have strengths that can't be beat, and sometimes GUIs have strengths that can't be beat. So I'm glad to be able to be part of making UIs when they're more useful in that way.
I think that's a really nice point to make too, is that different people have different styles of learning or doing things. I'm pretty vocal about it, but I have ADHD, and sometimes terminals just like really don't work for me because it's like, it's just a wall of text. No matter how much I configure it, it's just a wall of text. So it's actually been really nice to work with ours and be able to see these different components or aspects that actually make it feel more comfortable to me. But yeah, and I guess on colors and yeah, UI. I'm doing great today. We had a question come in that says, how do you determine what colors and gradients to use for the summary bars?
So I could rant about this for a long time, but I'll instead try to rant about it for a not long time. So first and foremost, I think we're definitely overdue to sort of rethink those colors. Kind of like academic high level chart talking. The grouping that we have is a nominal grouping where we want to sort of have each color distinct given its state. And then there's sort of like a little bit of a heuristic on top of that also. So like the fact that running and complete are both shades of green is intentional because they're sort of related. And we want fail to sort of maybe not be red because red and green is bad for color blindness reasons, but here we are. But we do want that to be distinct. It needs to stick out because failures are bad. And then the other states that I think are interesting, the pinning / starting state is sort of gray. I think that's good because that subdued color kind of means like this is a thing that is yet to be. And then the actual, or excuse me, that's queued. The pending one, when it's something that is no longer queued, but it's actually sort of in that transitioning into a running state, that's the only one that has this sort of striped pattern. And I think that's important also because it sort of conveys some movement. And we do that in other places also where, like for instance, the icon when a node is initializing is the only one that's animated. So these like little things that we can do, there's just like cues to sort of show movement are useful for these transient states. And then the last one is lost, which is sort of this deep blue black color that you don't see very often, which I guess kind of works nice because you see it and you're like, what is that? Which makes you think about it. So that's good. But yeah, I think that's sort of the rant that if I could change things, I would like to make the two greens a little more distinct, particularly because if you only see complete or you only see running, it's hard to distinguish which one you're actually looking at. And then of course the green red is a no-no, so we should change that. To think more about it at a systems level, this green color, which typically denotes success, is something we want to stick to, but at the same time, green is our product color. So there's constantly this struggle where it's like, should this be our product green that just happens to also mean primary and happens to also mean success? Or do we introduce a different green that means success? And now we have two different greens and that looks weird. So there is a bit of a color crisis there. But you know, nothing we can't overcome, I guess.
And Buck, did you have anything you want to add to this or say? Thoughts?
No, that was all in place when I joined. So I didn't even know any of that thinking. Actually, I just accepted it as it was. So it's cool to hear.
Yeah, it's always nice when you have things and you're just like, oh, that's the way it is. Then you hear the backstory and you're like, oh, that's actually a really cool backstory. I guess now I'm like questioning all the green in my background because none of it's the same color, but it's okay. oh, this is color looping. It's not even green anymore. Okay. Anyway, like what, I'm trying to phrase this because this is not my area of expertise, but you talked a bit about, I guess, it being hard for people who are colorblind, and what kind of other color options would be better for us to look at, or do you have in mind when we talk about stuff like that?
So first, a note on color blindness. There's an interesting, like, I just read a thread about this where color blindness kind of becomes like this front and center topic when we're talking about accessibility, because people talk about how it's like 4% of population. But if you dig into that number, it's actually like 8% of European men, and like nowhere near as prominent in other groups. So like it's just another way where sort of like the global north or like white supremacy sort of shows up in this weird systemic way, right? So that's one note, is that like I don't want to put too much focus on color blindness for that reason. But on the topic of color blindness, if you are colorblind, it is most likely you are a red green type of colorblind. So we can use basically any other color. So common other ones are like blue and orange, or even kind of like green and orange. The way that this ends up manifesting visually is you could distinguish sort of the shades. It's not like they look like the same color. It's just that, like, if I was to say, what does the red text say? A colorblind person would be say like, I know these are two different shades, but I don't know which one's the red text and which one's the green text. So in a certain regard, it's okay. But in like another regard, we could definitely do better by using a different color. The other thing that's sort of the web color excessive, what is it? WCAG? I don't remember what it stands for. But they always recommend to never use color as either A, a necessary indicator, or B, the only indicator. So using shape will also help. So some of the designs we had is like, we can keep using green and red in the bars as long as we also use some sort of shape indicator that says this red is actually something you should pay attention to.
Thank you for correcting to accessibility, because my brain was like, I know there's a better word for this and we don't have it right now. Please come back. So are there any other things kind of in the accessible space or accessibility space that I guess we're working on, or that we're excited to be doing, or we're hoping to do soon, or we're proud of doing?
I think we still have a lot of work to do left, but I did add some automated accessibility testing, at least. So there's this thing called AXE, or maybe it got renamed, I can't remember, that looks for like common things that you might not think of, like not using the same ID twice, or making sure images have alt text. It's like dozens of rules, so I can't remember all of them, but that is maybe the baseline that you can do in accessibility. You can't rely on automated testing alone for making sure your applications are accessible, but it at least is a baseline. So I think we will have several passes to go to still make sure or improve accessibility. Like one problem in single page applications, which Nomad UI is like knowing when something has changed. Like the normal pattern of server side rendering is you click a link, you are delivered an entire new page. So it's sort of like that's a break for you for a screen reader, for instance, to know that you've like gone somewhere. And if you have JavaScript updating just portions of the page, it's sort of hard to know like where is focus supposed to be, what has changed on the screen. So there's I think it's called announcement or root announcement, maybe. Like there's patterns about saying like, okay, now you're on the whatever page, and like highlighting, I mean like not visually highlighting, but like in some way highlighting the pages or the parts of the page that have changed and whatever relevant information is there now.
I feel like I could ask questions about this literally all day, so I'll stop for now unless people in chat want to ask them. But speaking of chat questions, the next chat question that we got was, how does the Nomad UI fit into a GitOps workflow?
I could take that one unless you want to, Buck. Okay, so I mean, I guess the short answer is it doesn't. At least in my mind, when I'm thinking GitOps workflow, I'm thinking things like webhooks that integrate into like the GitHub UI and stuff like that. And I don't think that Nomad per se is the right job. Nomad deployments are really useful as like a piece of it. So you can view the UI for a Nomad job and see a deployment sort of transition, especially if you're using canaries. You can use the UI to promote that canary. But I think to answer this, as far as like the HashiCorp portfolio goes, the GitOps workflow is probably going to come from Waypoint, and then Waypoint supports Nomad as a platform. So then you would have Waypoint as the GitOps piece that integrates into whatever your Git tool is. And then you could click through to Waypoint to see the deployment, click through from Waypoint to the Nomad UI to see the job overview page, and then potentially promote the canary from there.
Awesome. So I think we had a DAS walkthrough planned.
Yes, dynamic application sizing. That's the feature I worked on for Nomad 1.0. So the general idea is that you have your jobs and they're configured with certain amount of memory and CPU. And you can, this is an enterprise feature, so you run the monitoring sort of thing, and it looks at the usage of your process, and it's able to make recommendations. So it's saying like, oh, you actually should raise the amount of CPU and lower the amount of memory for this task, or task group, I guess. And there's a dedicated UI for the, oh, I thought I would have more recommendations. There they are. That seems bad. So you can just like proceed through your recommendations, and you can say, oh, we actually know that FS example CPU is fine where it is, so you can just ignore that one, but accept this one. And just typical things of like, you can say, I only want to see the namespace I'm in right now, or all namespaces, and filtering. And then when you go back to your job, you should find, well, I don't remember what I changed, but things have changed. So yeah, I think that will be helpful for people who, because certainly when I have been writing job specifications and I'm asked to define these resource limits, I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I'm a developer and I just live in a land of like infinite CPU and memory and pretend that nothing is ever a problem with that. So it's probably easy to make mistakes, like probably give too much if you're a developer, and then end up consuming a lot of resources that are unnecessary. So if you have something monitoring for you, then you can get these recommendations, and it should help be less wasteful, hopefully.
Buck, I think you can see the changes you made on the versions tab.
Yeah.
You can open those diffs up.
That's true. Yeah, I can show that actually. Yes, so there they are. So those, these are all fake recommendations that I just made myself. I didn't run this for like a week or whatever it takes to actually have real recommendations, but the real recommendation engine just uses the JSON endpoint, so I just put those in myself. Yeah, I don't know, that's a short demo maybe, but there's a lot of UI packed into that. But I think that feature is an example of a situation where the UI is pretty strong compared to what you would experience in a CLI. It's hard to understand. Like, there's like 5 different statistics, like the minimum, mean, median, P99, and max. Those are all part of a recommendation. And I'm sure you could fish through all those numbers on a CLI, but having a little chart there that shows you what is actually going to change, like is this an increase, is this decrease, is probably easier for most people. So I think the UI will probably be a primary way for people to interact with that.
I really like it. I mean, I'm biased, of course, but I see it. It's just like, I don't know, the bar design looks really cool because it could have just been a like very simple bar, but it looks nice to look at, and I feel like it gives me more information than I would normally expect for seeing something like that. This is just like a small curiosity question I had. I think at the overview, when you had the filters, most of them were like drop-down filters, but the one for all namespaces was a check mark. What kind of, I guess, decisions go, what thought goes into like the decision to differentiate the different pieces or stuff like that?
Yeah, well, Michael made the design for that, so maybe I'll pass that off, but I just wanted to mention that because I implemented the design, but it was very pleasing to actually like do because cool little animated charts are like fun to play with and fun to make. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I could talk about the namespace to talk about briefly. A lot of the decision making that kind of goes into like what type of UI control to use is forced by the underlying data model. So for instance, with namespaces, the way that the API works right now is you can choose a namespace or you can choose all namespaces. So the way that we sort of implement this on the UI is there's still like a namespace picker, and then the all namespace toggle works as like an override. And if you look at our existing like facets model where you can see like the dropdowns, those are all multi-select. So it would be inappropriate to use a multi-select for namespaces since you can't actually do that.
That makes sense. I mean, I figured whatever answer you gave was going to make sense. I just didn't think of it that way before. So
I've actually been lying this entire time.
Michael's like, it's actually smoke and mirrors. I'm just kidding. So another question we got was, I'm actually really interested in hearing this one. At what point or what things have you all not included that you wish were included in the UI today?
I'm definitely interested to hear your Buck's thoughts on this one, but I'll go first. First off, we have quite the backlog of things that I think would just be super cool. Something that we're talking about that may be short-term that I'm pretty excited about is integrating more of Console's feature set into the Nomad UI. And it's like, of course, these are distinct tools that do distinct things, but having to flip between the Nomad UI and the Console UI is kind of annoying. So we want to see, we're looking for opportunities there, which sort of in like the bare minimum case should mean basically seeing like your console health status inline on like job detail pages, which will be super awesome rather than having to sort of flip between the two and then also having to map job name to console service and stuff like that.
Yeah, we do have a huge backlog. So I guess like I feel like the UI should be able to do basically everything that you could do with the CLI, but there's only two of us and we can't do everything. So we have to be strategic about what we implement and leaning toward things that are sort of that the UI would be particularly good for, I think is a general goal. I think it would be nice to have more integration, like you were talking about with console, but just in general, like if people are running multiple HashiCorp applications, they're not really, I mean, they're integrated in various ways, but not in the UI sense usually. Like they're just switching between a bunch of different web servers. So some kind of meta UI might be helpful in that way. That's all I can think of right now.
Another one that just came to mind that goes back to the whole not complementary, but collaboration thing I was talking about earlier. We're looking at how best to surface ACL workflows in the UI, which I bring up in terms of collaboration because I think in a larger environment, it's reasonable that the person who is provisioning ACL tokens isn't going to be like the deep Nomad subject expert. And it's also reasonable to provision tokens sort of like out of band of, say, Terraform or startup scripts that will do that when you run a cluster for the first time. So it'll be cool to sort of explore that space, see what designs we come up with.
And a follow-up question we had to that one, and then I think we can go on to, oh no, I can't even say the long form of it, Topoviz. I'm not gonna try right now.
Topology visualization.
There we go.
Quite the tongue
yes.
twister.
I like thought about it and my brain just locked up and was like, nope. The follow-up question we had to the last one before we move on was, what kind of things make a UI too busy?
I guess I kind of want to rephrase it, because it's like, busy in my mind is one of those words that you use when you don't have a better word to use. No offense, Tracy, I love you. But like, if you think about a UI and you're thinking this is too busy, what you're probably feeling is you're looking at it and you're overwhelmed. And if you're overwhelmed, that can be for a couple reasons. Maybe there's just too much motion. Maybe there's too much sound. Maybe things are too small. So those are like some small design things that you can kind of clean up, make things bigger, add more white space, let things breathe. Another reason why something might be busy and you're feeling overwhelmed is just because this is the first time you're seeing it. Like CLIs are ridiculously overwhelming if you haven't seen it, but there are a lot of people who feel really comfy with like, a 32-inch monitor and 16 CLI screens open, because you're only looking at one at a time. So once you get used to that, it's no longer busy. It doesn't feel cluttered because you know what to look at. So that's another thing to sort of look into, especially when we're thinking about sort of the progression of someone learning Nomad and kind of getting comfortable to it is sort of, you don't want to overwhelm, but you also don't want to hold people back with like your all-seeing designer eye, right? Like if people are comfortable with like a jillion jobs on a page, then we shouldn't hold that back. And like, that's a real story, because it used to be that pages were limited to 8 things, and people were like, why is this limited to 8? I want to see everything all at once, always. Just put it in my eyes. So I mean, we changed that. Now you can set the page size and that'll store on local storage, and you can see more at once.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that that's a huge challenge in UI design, is how to make things approachable for multiple levels of comfortability or whatever. Like pro users don't want to be held back because you made a UI that's really easy to learn at the beginning. So like the ideal thing would be to have something that isn't overwhelming when you're new, but also isn't hiding everything when you are quite comfortable. And I think we have had some conversations about how there's a lot of clicking needed right now to move through the Nomad UI sometimes. Like if you know exactly where you're going, you still might have to click like 3 or 4 times to dig down through multiple levels. And it would be nice to add some shortcuts or whatever for power users, ways to get to the exact place you want to go when you know where that is. So that's always a thing that you need to think about, like how to add power user features without alienating new users and making it like even more overwhelming, because Nomad just conceptually is pretty complex. Like there's a lot of different concepts to learn. So yeah, that's something that we think about. I think the search UI, which currently is like V1 maybe, the global search, could be a way to make it easier for power users to skip around. Right now, it's maybe like 20% of the way toward that, because it doesn't know about some of these deeper things. It's not really capable of knowing because the API can't provide the answers, but that's something that we will hopefully improve.
Yeah, I have one more question. I lied. I'm just curious. We talked a little bit here, I think both of you touched on it, about the new user experience and how it can feel very overwhelming if you're new and kind of coming into it, but you don't want to limit the like more experienced users as well. Are there practices or concepts we've used to kind of reinforce that, I guess? I can rephrase that if that's not the best asked question.
I think it's well phrased. I'm just still trying to rack my brain for examples. I mean, one of them is is the node drain, which I mentioned a little earlier, where it's like, if you're draining a node in the UI, it's like you select one node and you click the drain drop down, you see the toggles, you see a little help text, what all of it means. You click it, and then it's like, hey, it's no longer eligible. And it shows you live allocations leaving. And that's like a very kind of handheld experience. At the same time, I've talked with our engineers that work on Terraform Cloud, which is on Nomad. And like, they're at a point now where they've written scripts where they'll do like full blue-green node drains by bursting in like AWS and whatnot. So like, maybe that isn't exactly what you're looking for, because it isn't like UI level 1 to UI level 5. It's more like UI level 1 to automation scripting level 5. But I really do try to think of like the whole continuum, right? It's like the Nomad UI, we don't want to think about the Nomad UI as just the Nomad UI. We want to think about it as a piece of Nomad, and we want to think about Nomad as a piece of your entire infrastructure. So I do think that still counts.
You know, I think even tiny things like you mentioned about the page size before, if you are somebody who's like, give me everything, like you can set your page size to 100 and that's stored in local storage. So then when you load it up again, it's going to be the same, which I mean, that probably sounds like nothing because of course your application remembers your settings, but sadly we live in a tragic world where we can't like know who users are or like sort of assign them information. So that's just a tiny thing, an example of like thinking about how to make it better in ways that we have available.
That makes sense. Like when you're talking about the page size, the first thing jumps to mind is me as an operator doing things. I probably only want to see a limited set, but also me as an operator with that classic TV on the wall. I probably want to see everything because I don't want to go find the Apple TV and connect something to it and scroll down and, you know, so that's really neat to think about for me because I just, you know, I've put it there and I didn't really think about it much because, but I guess with that said, I'll stop asking questions about that. And would you like to move on to Topoviz?
Yeah,
Topology visualization.
Oh, wow,
Oh
you
man, I
nailed
had to
it.
slow on that one.
Oh, that
There we go.
deserves one of these Zoom reaction claps. I don't know if that comes through the stream or not, but you deserve that. This will be a short demo. I actually kind of mixed it up at the last second. So since I already gave this demo at the 1.0 launch, which I think you can find on the internet, I want to instead do like a short sort of behind the scenes, like thank you to the community, because there was so much community involvement in topology visualization. So to start off with, this is now over a year ago that I sort of put this questionnaire into the wind, hoping to get some responses. And I did. So thank you everybody who responded to this. What I ended up doing with this information was breaking it down and then turning into this monitoring and forecast insights document. This is internal. I'm comfortable sharing it only because I think I can ask for forgiveness here. But this became sort of the like a piece of the research that went into the design and also sort of into like the getting buy-in to prioritize the project. I don't want to scroll because there are names, so I have another tab where I've scrolled already. But I broke the whole thing down into sort of this cohort analysis where we have clusters of different sizes, and based off the clusters of different sizes, where are people at? So for the most people who responded to the survey, at least, Nomad actually was the first orchestrator, which kind of talks a little bit about sort of like this Kubernetes versus Nomad thing, where a lot of people did actually start with Nomad. We talked about whether or not people use periodic or use parameterized. And the fact that so few people use periodic and parameterized, and some in the smaller cohort, not even sure, is actually what made me give a talk on this last year at Hashi Talks. Shout out to Katie who runs those. There's another one next month. I hope you're all signed up. And then again, sort of into like the satisfaction of Nomad and some like what tools are you already using, et cetera. So this is like 18 pages of analysis into this report. So it really was helpful in forming the basis for whether or not we should even do this. And if we're going to do it, what should we focus on? And if you've seen the presentation, we ended up focusing on this more small to mid cluster, kind of under the assumption that, like as we're talking about before, people will level up and eventually build out their entire monitoring stack. But we want to give somebody something on day one, rather than Nomad being one binary asterisk, 16 other binaries required to have a full experience. So that ended up becoming this prototype. I put together the whole thing here in like its own separate binary that you could run in your existing Nomad cluster to get, can I click this? Does it get big? Hey, look at that. So we had this UI prototype sort of branch that was built into a container that you could then run so we can get feedback without actually having to require an entire upgrade. And again, we got wonderful community feedback from this. So thank you all for being super fans, coming to these community office hours, making sure to rediscuss and helping us build stuff. And if you're seeing this for the first time, or you kind of want, or you've maybe like followed those and it's been some time and you kind of forgot about it, there's now a blog post that talks about sort of more of this idea behind it. And then also a learn guide that walks you through all the pieces of it, including a few potential places where it may be helpful for you.
Sorry, I'm tabbed in the other window, frantically typing to get those URLs so I can share them in chat. That's why I was like,
Thanks.
oh no, stress face, type fast. And then I typoed like 4 words. I was like, well, that's unsearchable. There we go. I think these are the two.
I can get them also. If that's
Sure, I got the
easier.
blog post. If you can just share the learn guide, I think.
Yep.
That's the one I'm. And then I think you might need to share it to like Slack or something, because I think I have to be a mod to paste links. But yeah, I think at the moment that's all we have for questions. So in chat, if you're in chat and you have questions, we're coming into the closing of this community office hours. So make sure you get those in so we can answer them for you. Let's see, I think that's your message coming in. Yes, it is. Perfect. Here, I should just say what I'm typing as I'm typing it, so it's not just me like mysteriously typing into the internet. But yeah, I always love our sessions, like talking about UI and stuff, and it's really nice to be able to talk with Buck as well and just kind of hear more. It's always cool learning about like things you don't know about, I guess. Words are not my friend today. Let's see.
Oh, while you're looking for questions, one other thing. Buck's demo was for an enterprise feature, but all of the enterprise, or rather all of the UI code that powers enterprise features is open source. So if you're just curious about those charts or any of the stuff that they wrote, the code is explorable, even if you can't necessarily run it.
So I guess a question I have is, if there were, I guess, like UI designers or front-end engineers watching this and they wanted to build an ops focused tool, kind of like what we've done that's heavy CLI, what kind of pieces of advice would you have for them? Sorry, that might be like more intense than I intended it to be. I just want to know too.
I mean, the first piece of advice is go for it. The second piece of advice, maybe, I don't actually know if I hold this one to be too strongly, but I think that the architecture that pretty much all the HashiCorp products use, where it's like have an API and then build the CLI on top of the API and then build the UI on top of the API, I think that architecture lends itself really well for at least having the opportunity to make like UI decisions. Because you don't want to find yourself in a spot where the CLI is like tightly coupled to whatever your backing store or whatever is, and then suddenly like that's closed off from the UI. And you don't want to do it the opposite either, where you like suddenly everything is like a Rails or PHP something page view that makes direct connections to a database, and then you have to redo all that for the CLI. So I think that sort of division of responsibilities works really well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, in case it's not clear to people, like the CLI is a client of the API. So when you are typing commands in the CLI, it's constructing requests the same way that the Nomad UI does, which is a great way to make sure that you don't have like the UI being like second class kind of situation. I guess just to add on to that, like I mean, maybe this is kind of snobby, but like if you use Go to serialize your JSON, like don't make empty be the same as null, because that's annoying. Like,
thank you for
it
that.
currently serializes empty arrays as null, or it's like, why would you do this to us? So we have all this code on the front end that's like compensating for weird Go serialization things. I mean, ultimately, I would say like choose JSON API, which is like a badly named standard for JSON APIs. But some kind of standard also can be helpful if you want to not think about your serialization layer, because Ember, like Nomad UI is an Ember application. So if you have a JSON API, compliant API, then everything sort of magically works. Like, of course, nothing's ever good, but you don't have to think about a lot of things. And I'm sure you could make that happen somehow, but anyway, we just have the messy API that we do.
Totally. Maybe on like a more abstract sense here, like the API isn't a means to an end. Neither is the CLI. It's like your API, your CLI, and your UI, they're all products. They all have users. They should all be treated as such when you're designing what to do with them next.
And I guess another question is, when we're designing features, what kind of checkpoints are there from the front end or UI perspective of, like, let's say I'm building a feature, I usually have to go, I don't know, research what I want it to do, what other options are out there, et cetera, and then implement it, and you get the feedback. Kind of in that phase of building a feature, I'm just hand gesturing wildly, hoping the words will come to me. But where are the good checkpoints to kind of bring in your front end or design person and make sure that everyone's on the same page? As like, words are hard. There's only two of you. There's so many features that need to be built. How is it best for you to kind of get brought into the team to make sure that these features are being built as best we can?
I think that early involvement is good from my perspective. Like, being able to participate in discussions about what the API, like the shape of the responses and I mean, of course, inevitably it turns into, there's always like quibbling about like what HTTP verb or like whatever code it's going to respond as. But it's people that are not working on the UI usually might not be aware of what some of the implications of the decisions they're making are. So having early involvement, I think, is helpful. And then also just constant feedback. So I'm always like making early PR and trying to get feedback as the process is going so we can have a more collaborative thing.
Yep. I think to talk to what you're saying there, Jackie, because it's like you rightfully call it that there are two of us and a lot more backend engineers, so we have to prioritize, right? A lot of this comes from a strong product team as well. To like, as I mentioned earlier, it's like philosophically, it's like we want to play to our strengths and sort of deprioritize things that may be our weaknesses. So that needs to kind of be determined pretty early on. And I think a couple of good projects for this sort of on both ends of the spectrum. Dynamic application sizing, we were brought in like immediately. We read the white paper that dynamic application sizing is based off of. We went through the process of creating user stories and whatnot before any of the backend code was written, except for maybe some like core autoscaler pieces. And then, so like that's an example of like us like really bringing in early because we knew there's going to be a UI component because if we could play to our strengths there. On the opposite end is something like CSI, where it's like the spec already existed and the majority of CSI is like plumbing between these like backend systems, where a lot of that work, it's like it needed to be done regardless of what our opinions were. So we came in later in that project and then we're able to sort of talk through what are the workflows, et cetera, that we can sort of either add or bend while still being in conformance or compliance to this spec. And then maybe like the kind of like a last bit here is I think that the disciplines of UX bleeds into UI engineering more than it bleeds into something like systems and backend engineering. And that ends up being really useful when we're sort of like in a team setting. So like we've had offsites where we're talking about sort of in the weeds features like CNI and stuff like preemption. and just be able to sort of not like control a conversation. I don't want to say that, but to just sort of like inject into conversations this idea of staying user-centered or putting yourself in the shoes of a user and sort of like to zoom out and just like actually express the workflow that you want. I think helps people sort of get out of a rut where you're thinking about all of like the sticky facets of this intricate system. And if you're only focusing on like clearly you have to focus on that to make something that works. But if you're only focusing on that, that's how you end up with kind of APIs with bad ergonomics, like Buck was sort of talking about.
Perfect. I didn't do a good job putting my thoughts into coherence, but you did a great job answering. So thank you. I was like trying to think on past experiences because I've tried to work with design teams before, but evidently that's not my forte. It's not my background. And it was like, I don't know what I can do to pull you in at the right time and make sure that I'm not like, shoulder tapping, flooding you with like ridiculous questions that you're like, no, we don't do this right now. Like this is the wrong time, or the flip side being too late. And then it's like, oh, well, the feature's built now, and now we want to rework it to be maybe more accessible, but it's going to be really hard to gut everything and do it right now that we've already done it wrong. So it's for me, it's really cool to be on a team where, to me at least, it seems like we do have a really good balance of when we get these like inputs and perspectives in. And it's really cool to kind of work on something that I feel like is usable and nice and a joy to use, actually. So having other things. But I think we are coming up on time. And I guess my last question is there any final thoughts or comments or things you'd like to say or ask of the community? Say to or ask, whatever.
Thank you for your bug reports. They're wonderful, especially namespaces ones. Namespaces is open source now, so it's wonderful seeing people sort of kick those tires and find new bugs crawling under logs. And we love fixing them, so please keep reporting them.
Where is best for them to give feedback or report bugs or engage with us about design?
Yeah, so I think that for bug reports, particularly GitHub issues is the best, but I think we also keep tabs on Discuss if you just have more open-ended things to bring up.
Was there anything you wanted to share, Buck? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off in answering that question.
No, I'm just happy that people use the software, and it is nice to hear. I mean, yeah, bug reports, sometimes they're stressful, but we always want to make it better. So it's ultimately valuable. Thank you.
Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been really excited about doing this session, like literally for months now. So it's really great that we're here, we're doing it. I really hope that we can kind of keep talking about design and how we do things here, even though I know it's only the two of you, so I don't want to just throw extra work at you too. But it's really cool to see it. I really feel like we're doing a good job here, and that's not even me like DAing, that's just me ops girl fangirling right now. But yeah, so thank you so much everyone that came and joined community office hours today. I had this open somewhere and I've opened like 20 tabs because people keep saying really cool things. I'm like, I need to look this up later. Where'd it go? Here it is. Our next community office hours is tomorrow, and it's going to be on the Terraform plugin SDK at 12 EST. And you can find information for our future and upcoming office hours here. I'm going to post it at chat. Here is where you can find upcoming info on office hours, so that I'm not just like, staring at my computer typing quietly. And I believe Tracy's hosting it tomorrow, so it'll be good. I'm definitely going to be there too. Yeah, I'm rambling. Anyway, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. Again, thank you so much, Buck and Michael, for coming on. And I hope everyone has a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next office hours. And oh, I'm missing so many things. We've got like a Nomad virtual day coming up on the 10th of March, not February, March 10th. We'll be having some great speakers. We're going to be talking about it. There'll be another office hours between now and then. There's more I'm missing, but I don't really know what it is right now. So for that, we'll just say thanks for joining and hope to see you soon again. And thank you so much, community, for always just being here and engaging. We love it. So yeah, see you next time.
Thanks for hosting, Jack.